Okay, in this section we're going to take a look at theories related to deviance. And the very first theory that we're going to look at is referred to as the anomie theory. Robert K. Merton. Merton was influenced by a concept that Emile Durkheim came up with, and that's the state of anomie. Durkheim said that the state of anomie was basically the state of normlessness. It's when a person, when the norms of society basically have no meaning to the individual. And so Robert Merton used that concept to kind of guide him in this theory of why people are deviant and how you can categorize these deviants. So that's what we're going to look at. Merton states that deviance results based on how the individual views the normal goals of society, as well as the appropriate means of obtaining those goals. So we're going to look at goals and means. Now, Merton stated that an individual would respond to the cultural goals in one of 5 ways, and that's where we have on the right-hand side. Now, we've got a lot of A's and R's, and let me explain what those mean. His first category is conformity, okay, the conformer. The conformer accepts society's goals, and they accept the normal means of obtaining those goals. So, you know, we tend to value having a lot of material goods or a lot of income, a lot of money, a lot of wealth, and the conformer accepts that, and he accepts the normal means of obtaining that. So he tries to get a good, education, get a good job, works, saves money, and so forth. That's the conformist. My favorite conformist of all time would have to be the comic book person Charlie Brown. Okay, Charlie Brown, I don't know if you know it, but he's close to 60 years old, if not a little over 60 years old now, and he pitches for his team, and of course his team's not very good. They've, in 60 years, I don't know that they've ever won a ball game, but he doesn't quit, and he doesn't cheat, he doesn't worry about it. He goes out, he goes full blast trying to win the game and trying to win a championship. He's not going to alter that in any way. That's a conformist. Now the second category is the innovator. The innovator accepts the goals of society. They say, for example, yes, I want to be rich, but they reject the normal means of obtaining that goal. So this is the person who says, I want to, have a lot of money, but I don't want to work for it. So they rob a bank, or they embezzle money, or something of that nature. The ritualist rejects the goals of society, but they accept the norms of society. Now that may not sound like it makes sense, but consider, for example, someone who is in a bureaucratic type job where day after day after day they've lost their goals. They've gotten to the point where they know that they're never going to make a certain promotion, they're never going to make a certain amount of money, and so on. But they blindly go day after day after day through the same motions or the same rituals that they have always done. So they're not going to deviate as such, but they've lost sight of the goals. Now the retreatist, we've got, these are people who reject both the goals and the norms, or the normal means of obtaining those goals. Basically, we're talking about society's dropouts. These are people who are homeless, the drug addicts, people of that nature where they've just totally lost sight of everything, and they've, they're not even attempting to make any means there. And then lastly is the rebel. The rebel, we've got all kinds of R's here. Okay, the rebel is one who rejects the normal goals of society, but they replace them with their own goals. They reject the normal means of obtaining those goals, and they replace those with new means. So the rebel is someone, for example, a member of a radical militia group. Somebody like that who they're within our society, but they don't tend to believe the same that everybody else does. They don't tend to, go about business the same way everybody else does. They're totally on their own agenda. Those are the 5 categories that Merton basically talks about with the anomie theory. Who are the most noteworthy, who are the ones we always hear about, tends to be the innovator and the rebel. Those are the 2 that you hear about a lot. We don't really hear about the other 3 very often. Second theory is the cultural transmission theory, or otherwise known as the differential association theory of Edwin Sutherland. Differential association, what that means, it refers to the ratio of normal to deviant or criminal associations that a person grows up with. For example, kids who grow up around people who are deviant or do things against the norms, they're going to learn that behavior. Okay, so essentially they're going to learn whatever they're around. If they grow up around people who smoke, they're probably going to smoke. If they grow up around people who drink, they're probably going to drink. That sort of thing. So it's one of those deals where essentially if you grow up in a household where normal behavior is the norm, that's what you learn, well then that's what you're going to do. But basically this theory says that it just kind of depends on who you grow up around, what ratio of people are deviant, and they say that deviance is learned. Now, next theory is the interactionist, it's again an interactionist theory, but it's the labeling theory of Howard Becker. And the labeling theory of Howard Becker basically says everybody's deviant. Everybody's going to be deviant at some point in time. But what he focuses on is whether or not you are labeled as being deviant. So there's a lot of emphasis in this theory on police, probation officers, psychiatrists, judges, teachers, people like that, in terms of how they treat or how they label another person. Now, in this, we can also kind of look at the whole issue of racial profiling. Kind of goes along. This has been in the news a lot lately with the Trayvon Martin case, and the fact that has been in the news quite a bit. But racial profiling, the idea that a person is identified as a criminal suspect purely on the basis of their race, and a lot of public scrutiny has gone into that kind of a topic and that issue here lately in America. Now, we can kind of simplify the labeling theory by looking at what we call primary deviance and secondary deviance. Now, primary deviance is deviance which is not detected by society. A person who, let's say, abuses alcohol temporarily after the death of a loved one or a failed business attempt, we generally don't regard them as being deviant. Okay, a college student who tries drugs once to see what everybody's talking about, we don't typically refer to them as a drug abuser. A lot of times that stuff does not get detected by society, so that's primary deviance. Secondary deviance, however, is deviance which is detected and the person tends to be labeled as being deviant. And that labeling arises more frequently when the person engages in repeated acts of misconduct. Now, let's say that an adolescent boy is brought in to the court system and charged with his first offense, which might be shoplifting. He may regard the experience with fear and awe, and if he's let off on the basis of his previous good conduct, the memory of the court appearance may fade, and so that act will kind of remain one of primary deviance. But if and the boy will basically be referred to as kind of a good kid who made a mistake. However, if he's bitterly condemned by his family and rejected by his friends, he may perceive that he's being viewed as a delinquent, and he may begin to see himself that way. And once he accepts that self-image, that incident becomes transformed into one of secondary deviance. All right, let's take a look at the control theory. And the control theory, this person's name is Travis Hershey. Travis Hershey, very influenced by a mild Durkheim, again. But basically, Hershey says deviance is natural. He said it's absolutely natural. There's nothing abnormal about it. Everybody's deviant. But basically, they look at the idea of community bonds. Durkheim kind of brought this forth with his study on suicide, saying that the more connected that a person is to their community, the less likely they will be to be, or the less likely they will, I guess, become deviant. Let's put it that way. So the more connections you can make. In schools try to get kids connected in any way that they can to the community, to the school community, because that reduces the likelihood of things like teenage suicide and, criminal behavior, things of that nature. So, the control theory basically saying deviance is natural. It's only society's attempt to control deviance that causes people to act in the same ways. The next theory that we'll look at is the conflict perspective, and Richard Quinney is a big-time conflict theorist. Basically, this views that the people in power are the one who they tend to protect their own interest, so they define deviance to suit their own needs. They kind of create laws that go along with their values, but not necessarily the values of society. For example, our society has laws against gambling, drug use, prostitution, but yet many of those are violated on massive scales. A huge number of people do those things, but yet they're considered deviant because the people in power define them that way. Furthermore, conflict theorists contend that the entire criminal justice system of the U.S. treats suspects differently on the basis of their race or ethnicity or their social class background. Quinney argues that in this way the criminal justice system acts in order to keep the poor and oppressed in their deprived positions. They don't want to give them a chance to get out and make something of their life. Take, for example, Warren G. Harding, won the presidency in 1920. In the 20s, early 20s, when he was president, they had massive parties upstairs in the White House with alcohol all the time. However, this was during the time of Prohibition. So again, it's a case where, the rich and the wealthy can kind of do what they want to, but everybody else in society had to obey the law. Last one that we'll look at is the feminist perspective, and that's very similar to the conflict, talking about people in power and out of power, but essentially the feminist perspective again focuses on the economic relationships. Says that cultural views and attitudes toward women have influenced how they're perceived and how they're labeled. Years ago, wives may have been reluctant to report acts of abuse to authorities because they might lose what their primary or sole source of income was, and that would be the husband. So, but basically they say that, over years, men have had a greater opportunity to engage in crimes such as embezzlement and fraud, things like that related to business. But as women take more active and powerful roles in both the household and in business, the differences between men and women in terms of deviance and crime will narrow. And it's kind of interesting because what they're saying is give women a chance because they can be just as deviant as men. And in the last 15 to 20 years, believe it or not, the statistics are proving that out. There's been more female arrest in the last 15, 20 years.